Before we dive into the specifics of Federal Rule of Evidence 403, let us quickly recall the foundational steps for admitting evidence. Evidence must first satisfy the basic relevance requirements established in Rules 401 and 402. If evidence is deemed relevant, meaning it has any tendency to make a fact of consequence more or less probable, it is generally admissible. However, relevance is not the final word. Rule 403 steps in as the crucial gatekeeper. This rule grants the trial judge the authority to exclude evidence even if it is technically relevant, based entirely on a mandatory balancing test. This test weighs the evidence's actual ability to prove a fact against the potential harm it might cause in the courtroom setting. Mastering this balancing act, probative value versus potential prejudice, is central to understanding how evidence is controlled in federal trials. We now turn directly to the precise language of Federal Rule of Evidence 403, the rule establishing this crucial balancing test. It states, "The court may exclude relevant evidence if its probative value is substantially outweighed by a danger of one or more of the following: unfair prejudice, confusing the issues, misleading the jury, undue delay, wasting time, or needlessly presenting cumulative evidence." Pay close attention to the mandatory language. The use of the word may confirms that exclusion is entirely within the trial judge's discretion. It is not required even if the dangers are present. Crucially, the threshold for exclusion is high. The evidence's ability to prove a fact must be substantially outweighed by the danger posed. This high bar ensures that only evidence posing significant risk is kept from the jury, maintaining the general preference for admitting relevant material. That high threshold requires us to analyze the two sides of the scale individually, starting with the evidence's strength. We now begin our deep dive into the first element, probative value, often abbreviated as PV. Probative value is defined as the evidence's actual ability to make a fact of consequence more or less probable in determining the action. A fact of consequence is an essential element of the claim or defense. Evidence possessing high probative value directly proves or disproves a key disputed issue. Think of direct testimony establishing intent or an undisputed physical link to the crime. Conversely, evidence has low probative value if it is merely cumulative, repetitive, or addresses a fact already conceded by the opposing party. If the evidence only slightly moves the needle on a minor point, its PV is low, making it much easier for the dangers listed in Rule 403 to outweigh it. Now that we have established the strength of the evidence through probative value, we turn to the primary danger that often tips the scale: unfair prejudice. It is vital to understand what the rule means by unfair prejudice. This is not merely evidence that hurts the opposing party's case. Almost all relevant evidence does that. Instead, unfair prejudice refers specifically to the danger that the evidence will inflame the jury's passions, appeal to their sympathy, or trigger irrational bias against a party, leading them to decide the case based on emotion rather than the facts presented. This emotional response distracts the jury from their duty to reason logically about the evidence. Therefore, when applying Rule 403, the court's primary concern is isolating and measuring this potential for emotional manipulation versus the evidence's actual ability to prove a fact of consequence. While emotional prejudice is a major concern, Rule 403 also guards against dangers that confuse the jury's ability to process the facts logically. This brings us to the second set of dangers: confusing the issues or misleading the jury. Evidence might not be inflammatory, but if it introduces complex, tangential side issues, it can severely distract the jury from the core facts of consequence in the case. Imagine a trial about a simple contract dispute suddenly bogged down in decades of unrelated business history. This tangential evidence forces the jury to spend valuable mental energy tracking irrelevant details. The danger here is that the jury substitutes this confusing, complex narrative for a rational determination of the actual elements in dispute. They become lost in the weeds, unable to focus on what truly matters for their verdict. This cognitive overload is precisely what the rule seeks to prevent. We have now covered dangers related to jury confusion and prejudice. The final set of dangers listed in Rule 403 relates not to the jury's perception, but to the efficient administration of justice itself. These are the factors of undue delay, wasting time, or the needless presentation of cumulative evidence. Unlike unfair prejudice, these concerns do not require the evidence to be inflammatory or misleading. Instead, they focus strictly on resource management. Undue delay refers to evidence that would significantly slow down the trial process without adding substantial value. Wasting time is similar, focusing on the overall consumption of court hours. Most commonly cited is the needless presentation of cumulative evidence. This occurs when the proponent offers evidence that merely repeats what has already been clearly established by prior testimony or exhibits. The court must exclude this material to ensure the trial moves forward briskly and respects the court's limited resources, regardless of whether the evidence is otherwise helpful or harmful. Now that we have reviewed the judicial economy factors, let us return to the central tension of Rule 403. The balancing scale between probative value and unfair prejudice. This is where the practical application truly lies, and it requires weighing the degree of each component. The court does not treat all evidence equally. If the evidence possesses very high probative value, for instance, if it offers direct, unimpeached proof of a defendant's specific intent, the danger of unfair prejudice must be truly extreme. Almost overwhelming, to justify exclusion. The scale must be heavily weighted on the prejudice side. Conversely, consider evidence with only marginal or low probative value. In this situation, even a slight danger of unfair prejudice can be enough to tip the scale decisively toward exclusion. If the evidence barely moves the needle on a fact of consequence, but carries even a small risk of emotional bias, the court will likely rule to exclude it. Understanding this sliding scale, how much probative value you need to overcome a given level of unfair prejudice, is essential for mastering this rule. We have established how the court balances the factors, but we must also understand the procedural framework surrounding this decision. First, consider the burden of proof. When evidence is offered, the general presumption favors admissibility. Therefore, the party seeking to exclude the evidence, the party arguing Rule 403 applies, bears the burden. They must affirmatively demonstrate to the trial judge that the danger of unfair prejudice substantially outweighs the probative value. This is a heavy lift. Second, consider the standard of review on appeal. If a party objects to the admission or exclusion, the appellate court does not re-weigh the evidence from scratch. Instead, they review the trial judge's ruling under the highly deferential standard known as abuse of discretion. This means the appellate court will only overturn the trial judge if the ruling was clearly unreasonable or based on an erroneous view of the law. Consequently, successful challenges to a Rule 403 ruling on appeal are quite rare. Now let us move from the abstract rules of procedure to a concrete, classic application of Rule 403, the admissibility of gruesome crime scene photographs in a homicide trial. Consider two distinct scenarios. Scenario 1. The defendant disputes the identity of the shooter, or the mechanism of injury is central to the defense theory. Here, the photograph has high probative value because it directly aids the jury in determining a fact of consequence. It will likely be admitted. Scenario 2. The defense readily stipulates that the victim died from a gunshot wound, and the cause of death is undisputed. In this situation, the photograph's only remaining function is to shock the jury and inflame their emotions. It has low probative value relative to the undisputed fact. Because the danger of substantial unfair prejudice vastly outweighs this marginal value, the judge should exclude the photo. The key takeaway is context. The same piece of evidence yields different results depending on what facts remain genuinely contested. We have seen how the balancing test applies in practice, moving from abstract concepts to concrete scenarios like photographic evidence. Now, let us zoom out to summarize the core function of Federal Rule of Evidence 403. This rule is the essential gatekeeper of the courtroom. Its purpose is singular: to ensure that every piece of evidence presented serves the truth-seeking function of the trial, rather than unduly inflaming the jury's emotions or wasting precious judicial resources. Remember this critical relationship for the bar examination. For exclusion to occur, the probative value of the evidence must be substantially outweighed by the danger of unfair prejudice, confusion, or delay. This high threshold, substantially outweighed, is what keeps relevant evidence in the case unless the danger is truly severe. Rule 403 is the final check, maintaining fairness and efficiency in the pursuit of justice.